Greetings, my scattered brothers and sisters in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that His presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. Well, today we are moving into Mark chapter 8, continuing on with Jesus, but it's really important to remember where we're at in terms of the end of chapter 7. At the end of chapter 7, Jesus has gone to the Decapolis area. And this is a region of 10 Hellenistic or Greek cities on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. So this is Gentile territory. So all along here, Jesus has been moving in Gentile territory since he went up to Tyre and he healed the woman's daughter, the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, cast out the unclean spirit. And you'll remember that conversation where Jesus said it's not right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. But she responded that even the crumbs fall from the table and the dogs are able to eat that. And so she gets more than crumbs. Her daughter gets healed. And then Jesus moves to the Decapolis area and he heals the man who is deaf and who has problems speaking. And everyone marvels that Jesus does all things well. And now we pick it up in chapter 8. And again, remember where we're at. We're still in this Gentile territory, the Decapolis. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come from a long distance. Some of them have come from afar." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them and also told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present, and having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. So here we have the feeding of the 4,000. And it's kind of interesting because we've already had the feeding of the 5,000. And so once you fed 5,000, 4,000, kind of no big deal. And you even wonder, why do we need to include the feeding of the 4,000? Feeding of the 5,000, that's huge. That's in all 4 Gospels. Feeding of the 4,000, Mark has it and Matthew has it. And it's interesting that the 5,000 get fed first and then the 4,000, kind of the order of the stories. And again, you're kind of wonder, okay, do we really need another feeding miracle? Yes, Jesus did it, but do we really need to hear about it? Because Jesus did so many things that the authors have to make decisions about what they're going to include. They cannot include everything that Jesus did. And so our question is, what does Mark and also Matthew, what did they see that's so important about the feeding of the 4,000 that they would go ahead and narrate it even after Jesus has already done the 5,000? Maybe specifically because Jesus has already done the feeding of the 5,000. Well, most important thing about this miracle, aside from it testifying to who Jesus is and that everyone who eats the bread that he gives is satisfied, most important thing is where it takes place. It's in Gentile territory. It's in the Decapolis. Feeding of the 5,000 took place in Jewish territory. Feeding of the 4,000 in Gentile territory. Oh, by the way, do you remember Jesus said it's not right to take from the children their bread to give to the dogs? That is like the children need to eat the bread first. Maybe what we have going on here is salvation to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. And it's kind of Mark's way of calling attention to that by making sure that this story is included. If we press on this a little bit further, not only do we notice where this is at in Gentile territory, but we also notice that there are 7 basketfuls picked up. There were 7 loaves of bread, 7 basketfuls picked up, and don't know how much weight to put on this. I'm sure there were 7, so I don't think Mark is just making up numbers, but 7 is kind of the idea of completeness or perfection, and some would call attention to that there were 7 Gentile nations, and others would call attention to 7 kind of this completeness that would represent kind of the full human race. So I don't know how much weight to put on that, but it is interesting that the word for baskets, it's a different kind of basket. Back in the feeding of the 5,000, kind of a lunch basket. But these baskets are commercial size baskets. They're made differently, they're bigger, and again, it might just be a way to highlight that this is Gentile territory, and the significance of the feeding of the 4,000 is that the Gentiles are included, that they are part of the ministry, part of the mission of God's kingdom, that they're not on the outside looking in. And that brings us to one more thing to highlight. Jesus says some of them have come from a great distance, some of them have come from afar. This is actually a way of talking about the Gentiles, that the Jews are those who are near, the Gentiles are those who come from afar. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul points out how Jesus is our peace. Not just a peace for the Jewish people, but the peace from those who come from afar. He's talking about Gentiles. And Jesus not only makes peace with God for Gentiles and Jews, but Jesus is the peace between Gentiles and Jews. And so that a new peaceful community is formed of Jews and Gentiles because of Jesus. And then we notice that there were 4,000 who were fed. Again, I'm assuming that's because there were 4,000. But you will find, if you do much research, some people say that the 4,000 would kind of represent from the 4 corners of the earth. So I don't know how hard to push on the symbolism of the numbers, but I'm pretty certain that it's significant where this takes place. Pretty significant that Jesus says those many came from afar. And so here we have Jews and Gentiles, the disciples are there, Jews and Gentiles having a meal together that Jesus provides. And they all eat and they are all satisfied. And that's good news for you and me, because if it weren't for the feeding of the 4,000, we wouldn't be included. Well, I'm assuming most of you are Gentile like I am. The feeding of the 4,000, the kingdom of God through Jesus, the peace that he makes, it extends to us, and we are included. And so I know Thanksgiving is approaching. Maybe you can think a little bit about your Thanksgiving meal as somewhat of a feeding of the 4,000, in which we are able to give thanks and rejoice together that Jesus came for Jews and Gentiles, and that he is our peace, and that no matter how far we come from, Jesus is the only one who gives us the bread that satisfies. Well, God bless. Have a great day and celebrate being part of the 4,000.